Okay, we are about 6 minutes in, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Christina Green. I am the Assistant Deputy Director with California Housing Finance Agency. We are here today to go over the revised combined budget that is shared between HCD and CalHFA. There have been some changes to the form, and we wanted to go ahead and go through them with all of you and also open the floor at the end of this presentation to answer any questions that you might have. So to go through some housekeeping items, all participants will be muted throughout this presentation, just so we can minimize the background noise. The chat feature is available and can be used. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. They will be answered either during the presentation or at the end. Also, at the end of the presentation, if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, we will take you off mute and answer any questions you might have if you want to ask them live. Also, this session is going to be recorded and will be shared on both CalHFA and HCD's website. I ask that if you have project-specific questions, to please direct them to the assigned representative, either with CalHFA or HCD, or you can send an email to the general email box for CalHFA. It's assetmanagement@calhfa.ca.gov, or HCD, which is amcbranch@hcd.ca.gov. If you happen to have any technical difficulties, please log out and come back in and reconnect, and hopefully that will resolve the issue. And from there, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Spencer Hankey, who is the manager over at CalHFA, to kick this webinar off.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us here today. I'm glad you're able to join in and kind of learn about the new revised budget that we're putting out between CalHFA and HCD. I'm going to go ahead and just share screen and start from the top, essentially going over to our website, downloading it, and then we'll kind of go through some different examples. I will leave some time at the end of each example that I go through to just answer any questions that may be specific to that example. And then at the end of the presentation, like Christina noted, we'll also have some time for questions. So essentially, to get to the new budget, if you're going through CalHFA's website, you'll just go to calhfa.ca.gov. That'll take you to our landing page here. From this point, you'll go ahead and click on Asset Management under Multifamily. And then you'll go up to the top here to Forms and Handbooks. And then you'll see in this top list here something called Combined Operating Budget. And this essentially is going to be the new form, as you can see here, updated April 2026. So what you'll do is you'll go ahead and click this link here, and it should automatically open up the file. What you're going to want to do is actually download it. You won't be able to really use it in the web version just because there are macros that need to be enabled. So you would actually just go ahead and download it, and then you'll open the file. So once the file does open up, the first thing you'll see here is a security warning at the top. What you'll want to do is you'll want to click Enable Content. So this allows the macros to actually run in the background. And as you can see, there is instructions here at the top, and they do say to go ahead and click Enable. So that's the first thing you're going to want to do. From there, it does look primarily the same as previous iterations or last year's, I guess, when we put out the new one. There will be some less tabs here. We did consolidate some of the tabs together to make it a bit more streamlined. And essentially, we do have revised instructions as well. The instructions should also be a bit more streamlined and step by step. So definitely utilize these as you're filling out the budget. I will mention them as we go throughout the examples. I'll mention some key points and some things to keep in mind, but definitely be sure to go back to reference these in the future as you're filling it out. So first, I'll go ahead and just kind of walk you through what a blank version of this looks like. and then I'll actually pull up some examples that are completely filled out just so you can get an idea of what it'll look like filled out entirely. So on the second tab here is going to be the checklist and certification tab. It should look primarily the same. This top section here is going to be for projects to enter in all the specific information. One key thing that we did change that I do want to highlight is this row 2 here, where it says select all project funding. So essentially, when you click into the box next to the agency, you'll get a drop down where you'll either select yes or no. So if you do have HCD on the project in any form, whether that be one of their various programs, you'll want to go ahead and click yes here. If you have CalHFA with a COSR on your property, so COSR projects should know who they are. Typically, it's our MHSA or SNP programs. But if you do have a COSR on your project, you would want to go ahead and select yes here. And then for all other CalHFA programs, so essentially that'd be anything that does not have a COSR. So that'd be our standard perm deals, our MIP deals, subordinate loans. Any program that does not have a COSR on the project, you'll want to click yes here. Now, for any of these, if you don't have them, if they're not applicable, then you would just go ahead and select no. So that's essentially how this top row is going to work. This will allow us on the sheets as I go through tabs 3 and 4 to have some more specific columns that reference each one of these program types. In terms of this information here, it should all work primarily the same as before. You're going to want to put in the name, the reporting period, the location, any of the program numbers, the individual who's preparing it, and the date it's prepared. On this right side here, you're going to want to put the total number of units. So if the property is 100 units, regardless of how many are split up between HCD and CalHFA, in terms of like rent restrictions, you're going to want to put the full total number of units here. Then what you would do for this box, HCD assisted, let's say for the particular HCD program, there's 20 assisted units, you would type that number there. And then for the CalHFA COSR programs, if you do have a COSR on your project, you're going to want to type how many units are covered under the COSR. So if you have 10 units outlined in your reg agreement covered under the COSR, then you would type 10 here. And then moving down to this section, this is just going to be where you can have a checklist here. So this can kind of keep things in line for the person who's filling it out. We would expect once the entire budget is filled out that these would be all selected to yes, just indicating that you did go through all 3 of these tabs and fill them out entirely. Then the person filling it out is going to go ahead and select who they are, so agent, borrower, or sponsor, and then they'll type their name, title, and date. So that's essentially how the form is going to work. Again, the biggest thing to highlight that changed here on this screen is going to be this row 2. It's really crucial that you go ahead and select which agency is involved. And for CalHFA specifically, if you have a COSR or if you're any other project, that you indicate that clearly there with a yes or no feature. So the first example that I'm going to go through is just a CalHFA budget, a non-COSR CalHFA budget that does not have HCD. So in that scenario, HCD would be listed as no, CalHFA COSR would be no, and CalHFA other would be yes. And of course, you would fill in all this information here and here. And then when you go to tab 3 to start actually filling in numbers, you'll actually see here this column called CalHFA other programs. So you can see that specifically relates back to this box here being turned on, allows there to be the column here that shows up. And similar to the last budget, anything that's in yellow, you can type. Anything in white is going to be an automatically pre-filled box. So what we expect is that you fill in all of the yellow here, this column, as well as the 8-month actuals. Filling in the 8-month actuals is crucial because it allows us to evaluate the variance between the 2 years. So it's really important that you fill these numbers in as well as the proposed budget in this column. And then I do want to point out that any variance of 10% or more, which will be shown in this column here, needs to be addressed with a comment in column P. So if you type in a number here, $1,000, and currently you're only at 200, you'll see this will automatically turn to red if it's 10% or greater variance. And so we would expect this column to have a comment here specifically addressing why that variance has occurred. So that's essentially how this tab of the budget is going to work. Other than that, it's going to primarily function the same as before. Again, keep in mind, we expect that only the yellow to be filled in. You don't need to worry about any of the white cells here. You'll only type numbers into the yellow cells. For any of the miscellaneous line items, so you see miscellaneous rent revenue or miscellaneous vacancies, you would go down to the bottom and then you would fill in what the miscellaneous revenue is. You type the number and it will automatically flow into whichever vacant or whichever miscellaneous row you're referring to. So there's multiple different boxes here where you can type that information in, and then it will automatically show up in this miscellaneous revenue line. So that's essentially how this tab is going to work in terms of the cash flow. And again, this is only for a CalHFA other programs project. So that's going to be any CalHFA project that doesn't have a COSR and does not have HCD involved. So from there, you would go to the cost of operations tab. You would go ahead and only fill in the yellow cells again. So you're going to fill in this portion here, and the numbers will automatically flow into this. And then you'll want to make sure you do fill in the 8-month actuals. Again, the same comment with the variances. Anything of 10% or more needs to be addressed with a variance comment. And again, that can be 10% greater or 10% less. Essentially, it's any 10% or more plus minus needs to be addressed. So you would go ahead and fill out all the yellow cells here that apply to your project. And then again, the same boxes for any miscellaneous line items. So for example, miscellaneous administrative expenses, you see that line item here, but there's no yellow for this cell. Because you would go ahead and type in any information here, you would type the amount, and then the total number here is going to flow automatically into this cell. So that's essentially how this new budget is going to work. Again, for the example of a CalHFA only budget. What I'm going to do now is actually pull up an example of a fully completed one so you can get an idea of what it would look like with numbers filled in. So this is going to be just an example here. So again, only CalHFA is checked here. There is no COSR and there is no HCD. So in that instance, you would only select yes in this box. You would then go ahead and fill in all the project specific information here. And then you would put the number of units. Again, because there's no HCD, we would expect this to either be blank or say 0. And because there is no COSR, this should also be blank or say 0. From that point, this is how it will look completely filled out. So again, the individual would go ahead and type in numbers in the CalHFA other programs proposed budget column. They would then type in the 8-month actuals, and anything highlighting red should be addressed with a variance comment. So any of these that you see red, I didn't type in any comments here, but that's where the project should go ahead and explain why that variance is occurring. And again, as we scroll through, you would only need to fill in the rows that are specific to your project. So if you don't have a second mortgage to report, or you don't have a monitoring fee, you would just leave those as 0. Just only type in the rows and the accounts that are particular to your project. So that's how the cash flow tab should look filled out. And then I will go over to the cost of operations tab. This is what it will look like filled in as well. Again, you would only be typing in the yellow cells here, and then it'll go ahead and automatically flow into our column. And then we would also expect, again, all of the 8-month actuals to be filled in. So just scrolling through here, just again, showing an example of what it would look like completely filled out. It should work primarily the same as what everyone's used to with the current. The only difference being the addition of the particular columns for each agency. So before it only said assisted and non-assisted. Now you'll see that it's particular to CalHFA other programs proposed. And so that's what the cost of operations tab will look like filled in. After all of those has been filled in, we would expect the person filling it out to go back and change the checklist of required items to yes. And then they would go ahead and fill in their name and information in this line here. And then they would send it out to their CalHFA representative. So that's essentially the first example. Again, this is a CalHFA non-COSR that does not have HCD on the project. Just want to go ahead and see from the chat, making sure that we leave some time here at the end to answer any questions before I move to the next example. I'm just going to wait for about a minute or two to see if any questions come into the chat.
Spencer, there's a couple of questions in regards to the rows being referenced. Do you mind clarifying that? I believe people are looking at the Excel documents, but the budget document itself has the columns per se, like the column A, B, C. I believe people are referring
Oh,
to.
the columns here?
Yeah.
Oh, I do see here. It looks like Martin asked columns G, H, and I are hidden on the presenter's
So I think
example.
referring to the Excel. Yeah.
So I think they're referring to, it goes from E, F directly to K. So the reason they're hidden is because those are the macros that are running in the background. Essentially, when you toggle some of these to no, it would then hide them. So that's why you don't see some columns here. But again, you don't have to worry about having to unhide any columns. As long as you select the correct program type that your project has, then the appropriate columns will appear here. Just looking through the chat, it looks like I see Zach here saying macros may be disabled. That is correct. Some folks have automatically macros disabled. So what they would want to do is go into the property settings for that document and allow the macros to run. I believe it's a security feature. Martin, I'll go ahead and address that in the future example that I'm going to show. It should show all of the columns. But again, as long as you're selecting the appropriate programs here, you won't need to worry about actually unhiding any columns. Everything should show up correct. All right, well, it looks like we've addressed all questions for this particular example. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next example. Starting again with the blank budget here, the next example that I'm going to go through is a CalHFA COSR budget. So again, that's going to be a project. Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm going to do an HCD and CalHFA budget with no COSR. So essentially, if you have HCD on the project, you don't have a COSR, so this would select no. But then you do have, let's say, a CalHFA perm loan or some other program that does not have a COSR, you would then select yes here. So again, in this example, you have an HCD, one of their program types, and then you have one of CalHFA program types that's not a COSR. You would select yes for both of those, and then you would select no for COSR. From there, like explained before, you would go ahead and fill in all the information here for the project. You would type in the total number of units. For this example, because you do have HCD, you would type in the number of HCD assisted units. Because there's no COSR, however, because no is selected here, we would expect this to be either blank or 0. So now from here, because we selected yes on HCD and yes on CalHFA other, you can see here now that the columns have been unhidden to show now HCD has CalHFA assisted and non-assisted, and then CalHFA has the other programs proposed. So again, these columns showing up here on this tab are directly linked to the selections here. So it's very important that you select the appropriate things for your project in order to be able to fill out the budget correctly. So from here, what the project would do, who's filling it out, they would go ahead and start by filling in the HCD columns first. This is another very important piece of this example because once the HCD columns are filled in, it will automatically flow into the CalHFA column. So again, I just want to go ahead and redo that just for everyone to see one more time. Of course, all of these do show as yellow, but the idea would be you would fill in the HCD portion first so that it will automatically flow into the CalHFA portion so you don't have to type the same number multiple times. So for example, if they had $1,000 of proposed gross potential rent revenue for the HCD assisted units and 5,000 for the non-assisted, it will automatically add those two numbers together and flow directly into the CalHFA column. So that's how this sheet is intended to be used when you have HCD and a non-COSR CalHFA project. Again, that just makes it a little more efficient for the user so they're not having to type numbers into these two columns as well as in the CalHFA. It will automatically flow into this one. So we would expect from there that the user would just go ahead and fill in this sheet entirely all the way down. And then they would move to the cost of operations tab. For this one, it's going to remain the same. The user would just input numbers into the yellow cells here in this column, as well as the 8-month actuals. And all the numbers will automatically flow into these three columns here. So for example, if the total number of units was 100 and the HCD assisted was 25, that would give you a 25% proration. And so now you see the HCD proration listed up here. So when numbers are typed in this column, let's say 1,000, it will automatically bifurcate those two numbers, and then it will just go directly into the CalHFA. So that's how this sheet is intended to be used. Again, you should only be for the cost of operations, you should only be typing in the yellow cells. So that's going to be this column here, as well as the 8-month actual column. And again, there is the same expectation that any variances of 10% or more be addressed in the comment section here. Once the entire budget has been filled out in terms of tabs 3 and 4, we would expect the user to then come back to tab 2, mark yes for all of these boxes, and then fill in their name and sign here in this section. So that's going to be from the blank version. I'm now going to pull up a fully completed HCD and CalHFA other programs example so you can see what that looks like fully filled out. So this is the fully completed version. Again, as you can see, HCD is marked as yes here, CalHFA COSR as no, and then other programs as yes for CalHFA. All the information for the project is listed here. And then they went ahead and listed the total number of units as well as the number of HCD assisted units. So from there, the cash flow tab will be filled out completely. Again, once the two numbers are typed in here, they will automatically sum and go into the CalHFA proposed column. Anything that highlights red here, we would expect to be addressed with a variance comment. Again, the formula here is essentially lighting up red anytime it's 10% or greater. So anytime you see the 10% or more that's highlighted red, you should be typing in a variance comment here. So as I scroll through, again, this is the budget filled out for a particular project. So you're going to only want to fill in the cells that are applicable for your project. And then for the cost of operations tab, you would only fill in the yellow here in this column, and then in the 8-month actuals. As you can see, when a number is typed in here, the proposed commercial does highlight yellow. CalHFA doesn't particularly deal with proposed commercial, but HCD does. So anytime you do have any proposed commercial expenses or revenue, you would type that into the corresponding cell as well. But for CalHFA purposes, we don't get involved with the commercial reporting. However, that is an HCD requirement. So again, just scrolling down here, you can see it's completely filled out. All the numbers were typed in this column here, and then they automatically flowed into these 3 columns. And then you would put in your 8-month actuals. And then anything that is greater or less or plus minus the 10% would need to be addressed here. So again, that can be negative 10% or positive 10%. Either way, it would need to be addressed with a variance comment. So after all the cells are filled in, the user would come back here, they would type in their information in this row, and then they would go ahead and send this budget to the appropriate HCD and CalHFA representative. So I'm just going to leave another minute or 2 here for any questions specifically for an HCD and CalHFA other programs budget.
Hi, Spencer. There are a few questions I'm going to read out loud. That way we can display it. So the first question is, what if there is no COSR, but HCD and CalHFA each regulate a different number of units? How do we use the form once for both agencies?
So if there's no COSR, essentially we would expect that the COSR units here be left blank. The user would fill in however many units are assisted through HCD, but for CalHFA, you essentially would not be listing any units because we would not want to bifurcate any of the expenses or revenues to those units. We would just look at the project as a whole. So the only time that we want to see units being reported or broken out from the total is if the project has a COSR. If not, for CalHFA purposes, this should be left blank, and then you would only fill in the HCD section. So if I go back here to the cost of operations, as you can see, there's an HCD proration. So it's prorating this $6,000 by 26.67%. But then the CalHFA portion is the entire proposed budget, the 6,000. So that's how we would expect it to be filled out. Again, this is for a non-COSR with HCD involved.
Thank you, Spencer. And there is another question that should have been answered by Spencer's answer. It says, what if you have less than 100% units underwritten by CalHFA other? So I believe you touched base on this. It's for CalHFA other programs, you would just select yes. Put in the total number of units, HCD assisted units.
Yeah, that's correct. If let's say your project is 100 units and in your reg agreement, the income restrictions for CalHFA are 20 units, but the project does not have a COSR, we would not be expecting you to put 20 units. We'd be expecting you to put the total number of units here. And then you would only put whatever the HCD assisted. You wouldn't need to list the 20 CalHFA income restricted units because we want to see your budget as a whole for the entire project. The only time the restricted units come into play are when there's a COSR on the property.
I think that should answer the question. In the same example, there are unrestricted units not regulated by either HCD or CalHFA. Not sure if your instruction will result in the information you're looking for.
So in that scenario, again, if the total project is 100 units, you would put the total here regardless of how many are being restricted. You would then put the number of HCD because HCD wants to see theirs broken out. For CalHFA purposes, the only time we want to see the units broken out is when there is a COSR involved. Otherwise, you would just list the total number of units on the project. Looks like that should be all of the questions for this example. I'm going to go
Spencer,
ahead.
there are questions regarding the macros being blocked by Microsoft, and I know that there's some that can't follow along. If that's the case, try to follow along with our examples, but you'll have to unblock it is as a trusted, and also indicate that's a trusted source. And if you have any questions, you may have to loop in your your IT team. There's a question about security risks. You'll have to speak to IT about this, but this template cannot be used accurately without enabling macros and unblocking the security risk.
Yeah, I would recommend if you are having macro or security risk issues that you reach out to your internal IT department to try to get that solved. Essentially, it may be some sort of restricted use that's already in place that you may have to go into like a properties or security setting to go around. But it's nothing that we can fix on CalHFA or HCD's end. That's going to be something you have to change internally. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next example here. So the next one would be a CalHFA only COSR budget. So with a CalHFA only COSR budget, again, that's just going to be a property that has a CalHFA COSR and no HCD and no other program. So the only program that they're part of with CalHFA is some sort of COSR program, whether that be an MHSA or a SNP or a shared housing, one of those sort of programs. So essentially what the user would select here is they would select no on HCD, they would select yes on CalHFA COSR, and they would select no on other programs. From there, they would fill in all the information here on the left side about the project. And then on this right side, you would put in the total numbers. So let's say in this case, there's 100 units. Again, in this example, there's no HCD, so we'd expect this to be either 0 or blank. However, in this example, there is a COSR. So let's say of the 100 units, 25 are covered by the COSR. That will now include the COSR proration of 25%, which will be important for the cash flow and cost of operations tabs. So once we move to the cash flow tab, you can see now that there is 2 columns that weren't there before. That is going to be the COSR assisted and COSR non-assisted columns. And essentially the project would go ahead and just fill out the yellow cells all the way down for each of the assisted and non-assisted. One thing that I do want to mention here that has changed from the last version for our COSR programs in particular is there is now a line item called CalHFA COSR distribution. And that number will be listed here once numbers are inputted into the cash flow and cost of operations tab. So when our COSR projects are filling out their COSR request form, this is the number that they should be using when they're filling in that form. Moving to the cost of operations tab. This one again works the same. You fill in all of the yellow here. You fill in your 8-month actuals here, and then you address any variances in column P, putting in a comment explaining why there is a 10% or more variance. And again, with the COSR proration, it will automatically prorate each of the line items for the assisted and non-assisted. So if this is $1,000, it's automatically going to take this 25% and put it here, and then put the remaining in the non-assisted. So you should never have to fill in any numbers in the white cells. You're only going to be filling in the yellow. So that's essentially how the CalHFA COSR budget is going to work. From here, what I can do is I can go ahead and pull up a completely filled out version so that you can see what it looks like when it's completed. So again, for a CalHFA only COSR budget, HCD is selected no, COSR is selected yes, and CalHFA other is selected no. The total number of units is noted here, and the number of CalHFA COSR units is noted here. From that point, when you go to the cash flow tab, everything in the yellow that's relevant to that project is filled in. And then as you can see here at the bottom in this CalHFA COSR distribution row, there's a number here lighting up in green. If this number is lighting up green, that means that's the number that you should be listing on your COSR request form. So for this particular project, they should be requesting $58,769. Moving to the cost of operations tab, again, the user would go ahead and only fill in the yellow cells here. Those will automatically then flow into these columns based on the proration. And then you would fill in your 8-month actuals, and then anything that's highlighting red should be addressed with variance comments here. And I did see a question just come in regarding MHSA projects with no COSR. They should be using the CalHFA other programs. So the only time the COSR should be selected as yes is if there is a COSR on that property. And again, that could be a SCOSR, a COSR, a MOSR, some sort of subsidy account with units that are tied directly to that subsidy in terms of the MHSA or SNP program. So in the case of an MHSA non-COSR, the COSR box would be selected no, and CalHFA other would be selected yes.
Hi, Spencer. There is a question that is asking for CalHFA non-HCD, how is account codes 5120 and 5121 populated?
5120.
So I'm assuming
I'm sorry, you said
5120,
5120.
yeah, right there where you're at, 5120, 5121. I'm assuming the questions regarding the total proposed, how is that populated right next to it?
This number is populated here in this column by summing these two numbers together. So once the user types in the yellow, it automatically sums the two to create the total column. So I hope that answers the question there.
There's another question that says column A, expenses, is 100% total expenses.
Is that going to be here?
I'm assuming, yeah, it's under questions for cost of operations. Column A, expenses, is 100% total expenses.
Yeah, so the project should be listing the total expenses for the project here. And if there's any sort of proration, it will automatically flow into these columns here. But they should be listing the total in column A for the entire project. And again, like I mentioned earlier, if there is commercial, you would go ahead and mark that here. But otherwise, the total budget should be put into this first column here, and then it will automatically flow into the corresponding columns here. So that is a CalHFA COSR without HCD example. I'm just going to leave another minute or so for the chat just to see if there's any other questions.
There's a question regarding why not year to date instead of 8-month actuals.
So the idea would be that you would use essentially if you're, let's say a fiscal year end 12/31, your budget is due to us by November 1st. The idea would be you're probably filling it out in maybe September or October. So we'd want you to use the first 8 months of that fiscal year. So that would be January through August. We know at the time that you can be filling it out, you may not have, let's say September, October, the books might not be closed yet. So that's why we ask for the first 8 months of the fiscal year. It just makes it a little bit easier for us.
There is another question I believe we answered. If you have an MHSA project, but it doesn't have COSR, which budget are you using? Is it other or COSR? So just to, yeah, thank you. So yes, you would put no for COSR, even if it's an MHSA unit, you would put no, and then CalHFA, other programs, yes.
So the budget due, I do see a question here. The budget due date for fiscal year end 6/30 is due May 1st. All budgets are due 60 days before the end of the fiscal year. So that would be May 1st for that particular project.
There is a question for HCD.
Yeah.
There's a question asking HCD is requiring reporting financials on fiscal year. Is this report being used?
Yes, it's a SIP report. I will go through an example of that. This report being used for fiscal end or annual reporting for those projects that don't submit a financial statement. So I will go over that in a bit.
Thanks, Sergio. I think I'll go ahead and move on from this example here. The last kind of possible example would be a project that has HCD on it, a CalHFA COSR on it. In the past, with the past budget, there wouldn't have been any room to actually list all of the revenue and expenses for each one of those. So I'm just going to briefly show what it would look like, but I don't have an example of it completely filled out because the prior iteration of the budget didn't actually allow for this kind of combination. So essentially with this example, there would be HCD involved, there would be a CalHFA COSR, and then there's not any other CalHFA program on the project. So in this instance, you would fill in all the project information here on the left side, just like the previous examples. And then you would put in the total number of units here. And then for this example, you would have an HCD assisted. So maybe it's 25, let's say. And then you would also have a CalHFA COSR. Maybe we'll make this one 30. So in this instance, when you go to the cash flow tab, you'll now see that there's actually 4 columns. So 2 for HCD and 2 for CalHFA. The 2 HCD are the assisted and non-assisted, and the 2 for CalHFA are the COSR assisted and non-assisted. So essentially what the project would do is they would fill in each one of these yellow boxes accordingly. And then they would do that all the way down throughout the entire budget. And then moving to the cost of operations tab, you would still only fill in here in this column. But what it's going to do is it's going to use the proration from each one of these percentages to then place the numbers in the corresponding column. So again, if this is 1,000, you'll see the 25% proration was used for HCD, and then the 30% proration was used for CalHFA. So essentially what the project would do is they would just fill in all of the numbers all the way down, and then the budget will automatically fill in for each of the 4 columns depending on the proration percentage. So again, I don't have a completely filled in example of this because this combination wasn't possible before on our previous budget, but it does work primarily the same as the other examples. Essentially, you would just be filling in a bit more numbers, like on the cash flow tab, you would be filling in 4 numbers here across. Just checking the chat here to see if there's any questions. Looks like Sophie asked, for the current year 8-month actuals, are we entering the actuals for the entire property? In our case, we have both CalHFA, COSR, and other property units plus HCD. So yes, you're always going to be entering in the actuals for the entire property, regardless of how the units are split up between the agencies, or even if if some of the units aren't covered under CalHFA or HCD, we still want to see the entire property reported here under the 8-month actuals. Just going to give another minute or so for the chat, but essentially this is the last example for CalHFA. So what we went over is we went with a CalHFA only non-COSR budget. Again, just to remind you, a CalHFA only non-COSR would be no on HCD, no on COSR, yes on CalHFA other. We went through an HCD budget with no COSR and with CalHFA other programs. So you would select yes, no, and yes. We went through a CalHFA COSR only budget. So that would be HCD no, COSR yes, and CalHFA other programs no. And then the final one that we went through was an HCD with a CalHFA COSR. So again, it would be marked yes here, and then no here. So there's a few different combinations that we're kind of expecting to receive from the projects. That should kind of incorporate essentially every project that we have should be one of those combinations that I went over. If while you're filling this out, you're confused about what you should be selecting here at the top, or you feel that maybe there's some other combination that we're not aware of, please ensure that you're reaching out to your CalHFA and HCD rep to get clarity on how this section should be filled out at the top. So that concludes CalHFA's portion of the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here, and I'm going to turn it over to Sergio at HCD.
Good morning, everyone. I am Sergio Garcia with the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'm one of the representatives in the asset management unit. I'm going to be going through. It's really the last type of budget. So it's just the HCD budget that has no CalHFA funding or any CalHFA COSR. So I will go through both some of the budget with the restricted and assisted units. So I'll show one field example. I'll go through how to download it from our website. And I think Spencer and the CalHFA team shared some of the issues on the risk on the macros, and what needs to be done in those cases. So I'm going into this is the HCD website. You would go under, as you can see here, you would go under Hub Over Grants and Funding to download it, and click on Reporting Compliance and Loan Programs. So we'll click on that. It will take us to the reporting and compliance loan programs page. And it's the budget that we are just going over is the very first one here. So we would click on that. And so we would want to download it, and you choose where you would want to download. If it's your desktop or anywhere in your computer. And so there it would populate. There. As Spencer mentioned at the beginning, you want to enable it and do save it as. And you want to save it wherever is it that you wish to save the budget itself. Okay, so as I mentioned, I think the only last example is a HCD only. As you can see here in the first row, I selected only HCD yes. This is my first example is it's for that follow UMRs and not our legacy deals, which I think Mary asked on the chat. Those legacy deals don't submit a audited financials. They actually submit a report. So I'll go through that example and how that is submitted. But I'll first touch on the budget. So you can see here, it's ABC Apartments, the reporting year. So I also saw in the chat there, this budget form should be used immediately. And for these budgets that do, or projects that do submit annual reports from fiscal year, which is your July 1st to June 30th. So they will be due 5/1. So we will require this particular version. So in this case, this is MHP, so it does follow the 2017 UMRs with total number of units. In column here, I'm putting column, so it's 89 units, and the restrictor 89. As Spencer also mentioned, this is just it's a completed version of a budget. So so I'm going to go into tab 3, cash flow and analysis. The cash flow you want to put in, this is strictly a HCD. It shows here the restricted units. There should be none for non-restricted because obviously it's that's what we put in tab 2 on the checklist. So this is what it should look like. Some of the things that we would question and we would need an answer on the comment section would be on the cash flow analysis is the debt. Make sure we if you do select and put on debt, please explain what the mandatory debt is. We do reference the regulatory agreement and want to make sure that it does follow any of the information that you're submitting or inputting in the budget, that it is following the regulatory agreement, specifically Exhibit C. Any changes or we want an explanation. So just make sure you do put that. And I think that's one great tool in this new form is that we do have, a comment section that does help with the review process with the reps. So make sure you put also your HCD required mandatory debt. This is your 0.42, and in the reserves as well. You want to put that in there. If there is an increase if we do see an increase that is different than the regulatory agreement, we are going to question it and ask the reasoning why, if there isn't any. We may ask for some additional documentation at that point, a revenue and expense analysis, and possibly a P&A for certain situations. So that's the cash flow analysis, and then the operating. It's pretty straightforward. This is since there's no just restricted units, all the information should flow on here, and if there's any variances, just make sure it does help the reps with HCD and CalHFA. It lessens the back and forth and making sure the reasoning why there's higher variances, either if it's a negative or a positive, a less than or more than. So and that's pretty much another question that we might want follow-up is if we do see greater increase in supportive services. So at that time, your representative will reach out at that if it's more than what's on the regulatory agreement or on the supportive services cost form. So we will question that. And that's pretty much when our review is done. We would send out how we review it. We would want to make sure, as you can see here, it's for HCD and CalHFA use only. So make sure it's submitted. You don't submit it, clicking yes. We will send out a PDF version of tab 2, 3, and 4 of what our approved amount is. It's pretty of an approved budget, and what that cash flow would be, just similar to the same emails you guys are receiving of what that cash flow is, and what we approved as a replacement or operating reserve. So we would make our own comments. This is what looks like what you guys would receive. We would make our notes here based on those expenses. And that's pretty much for a restricted. For those legacy deals, legacy deal would be one of our CHIRP deals. So as you can see, I just want to point out right in this row how it's going to change as soon as I put in one of our legacy deals. It should turn to assisted. So it does turn from assisted. I think there was a question on that in the chat earlier. So it would change it. Some of our older deals are different. So, this is something more similar to that. There's total 90, 89, right? The manager unit. And so this would populate. I can change that. And this is what we should be receiving, HCD and CalHFA, well, in this case, just HCD and our review. Everything looks good. Then we will send a PDF version and Excel version for those legacy deals as approved. So one of the questions in the chat was how we use this particular form as well as to submit annual report. So for the annual report, we want to, for those projects, which is a very small percentage, you want to click on tab 3. You want to right click and select unhide. And then we're going to get a pop-up actual cash flow and actual cost of operations. We want to click both, and they should populate on right below as tab 5 and 6. So this is what we should, what you should be submitting. Since we're just using this form, I don't anticipate these the annual reporting to be coming in until later next year. So for actuals, but you want to make sure you again complete all the information here, and we would then, after the review process, we would click on yes, and we would send this as a PDF and approved. Once we do that, then the annual report is completed. So a couple things on the annual report. We're still are also going to need other supplemental information, the replacement operating reserve bank accounts for some of these legacy deals, CHIRP, SERP, CalLAP, those programs, and the AMC 184, as well as other programs, other reports that may be necessary to complete the annual report. And those, as you may know, you have to reach out to if you don't know, make sure you reach out to your representative. But that's pretty much my presentation on the budget and the legacy deal annual reports. I'll take you back to Spencer.
So that concludes our presentation, actually. So we're going to open the floor for some questions if you would like to ask real-time questions. So at this time, if you do have a question that you would like to ask outside of the chat, we ask that you raise your hands, and we will call on each individually and unmute your mic at this time. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Oh, I'm sorry. Please raise your hand using the raise hand feature, so you can go under the react icon. It looks like a little heart, and then there's a raise hand option.
Spencer?
Yes.
Can you go ahead and share screen on how they can use the raise hand it appears it's hard to navigate. If you're not used to Zoom, it's hard to navigate through it. So can you show me?
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can everyone see my screen? You can see it, Christina?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so you would go down here at the bottom where it says React.
Well, it's only showing your screensaver.
Oh, I don't know if it will actually show the Zoom
Oh, okay.
because it's yeah. Well, if you go to the bottom, I'll stop sharing because it doesn't look like that's working. If you go to the bottom of Zoom, a little bar will pop up where the chat is. It says participants, chat, React, and maybe some other things. You would click on React, and then it says raise hand, and then you would go ahead and click that.
Looks like we do have two questions. I'm not sure which order they came in. Jean, I guess you would be first, and then Martin, sir, you would be the second person to ask your question. I do not see any other hands aside from those two.
Hi. I just wanted to ask if HCD is putting a cap on the rents this year, and if so, what is the percentage of the cap?
Sergio, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
It looks like Tran put it in the chat. She asks, is HCD putting a cap on rents this year? And if so, what is the percent on the cap?
Yeah, that's still to be determined. That reach out to your representative and they can be able to assist you with that.
Thanks, Sergio. It looks like Martin has the next question. If we can unmute him to allow him. Thank you.
So when I submit this to Mary Rice, do I leave the green box alone? Or do I say yes or no once I'm done? I mean, yes, once I'm done.
So the green box that Sergio showed is only something that either CalHFA or HCD uses. That should not be used by the projects. Essentially, it allows us to then make any comments in our own section. And then when we send you back the approved version, we would go ahead and have a PDF and you would be able to see our comments listed there. But for the project's purposes, you guys should not be toggling on and off the CalHFA HCD review green box.
Thank you, Spencer.
No problem.
There is a question that's in the chat. I don't see any more hands, but there is a question that came in the chat. Can you go over how to unhide the columns for the annual reports?
How to unhide them? Yeah, I can go. Let me. Let's see here. Share. Yeah, so let me so you would click on let me first hide them. So all you do is to click on the cash flow tab, which is tab 3, and then just right click on your mouse and then it'll say unhide for the annual report. So you click on hide, then you get this pop-up. You want to click on, you can just drag it down the mouse, hold on to it and click on it, and then you should have both of those tabs. If that doesn't work, you can do one at a time. But that's how you would populate tab 5 and 6 for actuals.
And Sergio, there is another question that asks if they will need to fill in tabs 5 and 6 for HCD purposes.
For HCD purposes, that is correct. For those legacy deals, as I was mentioning in my presentation, yes. For those projects that only submit an annual report, versus a financial statement, yes.
And also, if anyone is still having trouble with the raise hand option and you're wanting to ask a question, please feel free to just maybe drop a message in the chat letting us know you have a question that you would like to ask, and then we'll unmute you. Looks like we don't have any other questions. Again, if there are any questions that come up after our presentation, please feel free to reach out to your reps at HCD and or CalHFA. And I also dropped in both agencies' general email boxes in the chat. Thank you, everyone.